Hi, hola. I'm just going to find my presentation to be shared with you. Get started. I hope you can all see the presentation. I'm almost sure you can. So, hello everyone. I hope this recording finds you well. I'm curious to learn a bit more about narratives, storytelling, and their powerful impact on social transformation in this brief course, La ficción narrativa y la transformación social de los relatos medievales al storytelling actual. So, mi nombre es Liliana Aristimuño, and I'll be in charge of sharing the contents of the very first unit in this course, Fundamentos del Storytelling. So I will be sharing this unit with you in 3 videos, each covering key points about narratives and storytelling as social transformation tools. Each section of this will present a brief summary of some concepts that you can learn much more about. If you want to, and I'll be suggesting some of the readings that you can do if you want to start this learning journey. In each of the presentations, you'll have some readings, and then you can find some of these readings available on the Moodle platform. Some others you can download, some videos as well that you can watch. I've tried to include some, this one video in Spanish and one in Portuguese that give you a clear reference of some key concepts. So this is the outline of this whole unit, and we'll have the narrative genre from a systemic functional perspective. We're focusing on how, when we're performing and we're voicing a text, there are some changes that occur in the way that we use language. We'll also be focusing particularly in our second video, I'll be focusing on emotion in storytelling, both the verbal and the non-verbal resources, that is to say the vocal and the facial resources that we use to express them in storytelling. And then on our last video, we'll have a little bit of time to cover narratives and storytelling as social transformation tools. And we're going to be looking into the symbolic articulation, okay? Okay, so let's get started with our first video. And here what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sharing some basic ideas about systemic functional linguistics and its perspective on the narrative genre. We will also focus on the impact that changes, as I said before, that going from the spoken or the written to the spoken and the spoken to the written, how that impacts language choices that we make. And and we'll look at one example in particular. So for this introduction to SFL, I will assume very little previous knowledge of the theory on your part, and thus I apologize if this is not the case for some of you and you find this a bit simplistic. As this is a very brief introduction, we won't be able to cover all the wonderful tools that SFL has to offer to understand and describe language, and as well as other semiotic resources. However, you do have a lovely introduction to the main tenets of SFL written by a group of Argentinian systemic functional linguistics that are led by Cristina Bocchia at the University of Mendoza, and which is the first reading you're going to find suggested for this course, and it's available for you to download for free from the publishers in the link that is provided on Moodle. These main tenets of systemic functional linguistics are built on a perspective that considers language from a functional and contextual point of view. It proposes that language is dynamic, complex, as a system of meaning-making resources, and therefore we make meanings by choosing one option instead of other or others, depending on how many possibilities we have. The meanings that we make are in this choice, and we can explain the meaning by reflecting on the oppositions. So what is and what is not. Let us illustrate this idea with a simple example coming from the text that we're going to be working with throughout this unit, which is the story of Cinderella and the storytelling performances of Cinderella. So let's imagine that we want to share this moment in the story of Cinderella, as we have here represented in this image that was generated using OpenAI. Now, we could say something like, an invitation arrived at the palace. It caused great excitement. Or we could choose to represent this experience with a more personal touch, saying, we've got an invitation. I'm so excited. Looking at these couple of instances of text, we can see that the storytellers made different choices to represent this experience, as these two examples actually come from my data set. SFL offers us different tools to explain how these two texts are similar and different at the same time. And it gives us the tools to describe the choices that the speakers make. So using these SFL tools, we can talk about, for example, what experience we are representing with language. That is to say, what ideas we're expressing, the ideational function of language. These meanings in this case would be the invitation, that it arrived at a palace, and that it caused great excitement. Excitement as a key feature as well. Now, in the other example, it is a more person-focused example. So we've got we and I as part of the experience, an invitation, and the idea of excitement. Now, using the SFL tools, we can also talk about how the text is shaped, how the information is organized. So we're focusing on the textual structure, the textual meanings. And for example, we could focus on whatever comes first, the theme, and thus see where is it, what is this point of focus or the point of departure for all of this experience. And in this case, we can see that in the first case, we've got a theme, the invitation. And in the second example, we've got people being the point of departure, we, I. Finally, we can use the SFL tools to focus on who are the people interacting, who are the participants interacting in this text, who are the people interacting in this text. So this interacting with others, the interpersonal function. And in this case, we can say different things. We can say, for example, that both are statements. So in both cases, we are giving information to the person listening. Both of them have positive polarity. Both of them have are declarative sentences. But, however, we can see that in the first case, we've got a more academic kind of text where there are no people, more objective kind of text if you want it. Whereas in the second one, we've got the people involved, so it is more personal. And the presence of feeling is felt by the people in this representation of the experience. Now, SFL shows these choices in system networks. This is something we're not going to be able to cover in this very brief introduction to SFL, but it is worth knowing that, for example, as we see here, we can represent these choices that speakers make by creating system networks where we have, in this case, the choices of polarity from the system of mood, positive or negative clauses. Now, as we have seen in our example then, the choices that we make create different kinds of meanings, but all at once. Now, we can see that these language choices create meanings that construe experience, that enact social relationships, and at the same time organize our messages. Yeah. Now, this language that we are choosing, these meanings reflect culture. They are expressing our values, our beliefs, our attitudes. And at the same time, our language choices are reflected, are affected, my bad, and impacted by the situational and the cultural context and by the social purpose of our text. So this image we've been looking at shows how the SFL perspective allows us to account for descriptions of text, considering the whole contextual picture. As we have tools to describe the social purpose of texts, considering the culture of situation a situation occurs in, but also some key variables that influence our texts, as we've mentioned before. The field, the tenor, and the mode. So these variables represent these choices that we were talking about before, what the text is about and what activity it helps us to bring about, who, that is to say, the roles and the relationships of the interactions of the text, and the mode of communication, how spoken or written the text is, or somewhere in between. At the same time, of course, it offers us tools to describe language, the language choices that we make that express the meanings that we want to convey. So in this approach, we can take a top-down perspective to explore the texts, considering the context in which the language is used, with the genre, the specific social purpose that we want to achieve, that is to say, in more technical terms, the genre, which is the most abstract level of the model, and it maps the system of social processes through which we live our lives. That is to say, the different genres, the different text types in which we engage, and that are available in our culture. At the same time, the different configurations of choices that will allow us to achieve this purpose in terms of these contextual variables that we talked about before. The register, which includes 3 dimensions: field, the what, the tenor, the who, and the mode, how we're using language to communicate. Some of the readings that you can explore to deepen your knowledge about this are included here. The full references will be at the very end of this first section in this unit, and you'll see that all of the different references that I'm using in this video are also included at the very end of each section. Now that we've covered the context, we can also focus. SFL offers us tools to move into the language choices that we make. And here we have choices that refer to how we create meanings in discourse semantics, the different kinds of wordings and how we connect one another, these wordings, how we create our messages with a lexical grammar, the different syntax that we select, the different grammatical choices, and the different wordings that we use, right? So that's why lexical grammar. And then the resources that we choose to share, to express this by means of sound in phonology, if we are in the spoken mode, or graphology, if we are writing the text, and also this paralinguistic, this paralanguage that occurs, that accompanies the language. Again, we've got some interesting readings there that you can have a look at if you want to deepen your knowledge of this. Now, this relationship between context and language can be represented as we have in this image, where we have, I tried to create this idea of a mutual influence where language reflects the context. So, for example, if I say something like once upon a time, or érase una vez, or era una vez, you can probably guess that we'll be sharing storytelling time. Now, at the same time, the language that I used reflects and projects this specific context. So we can see that the purpose of storytelling also impacts the language choices that I have. And in this way, one thing reflects the other, and the context affects the language. That's why a mutual influence. Now, some readings that you can make if you want, you can do if you want to have an introduction, to SFL as a whole. I've included one in English and one in Spanish that you can, try to find it probably in your university library so that you can, deepen your knowledge of SFL from more holistic kind of perspective. So, what is Randra? Yeah, this idea of this social activity. Excuse me. We're focused today. Essentially, genre refers to different types of texts that form predictable structures that we can recognize by listening to the language features that we find. So we can recognize that someone is explaining or sharing recipes or describing things to people or narrating a story, which is different in a sense from sharing an anecdote, for example. So we can reflect on the language features that make each of these genres a different social activity that we engage in as part of a community. So theoretically speaking, from a systemic functional perspective, the genres are staged, goal-oriented, purposeful social activity that we engage in as speakers of a language and members of a culture. It is staged because it usually takes us more than one bit to create these meanings, to work through as a genre. It is goal-oriented because unfolding phases are designed to accomplish something. And we get a feeling of frustration if these phases are incomplete or if we're stopped in the middle of a story, for example. And then finally, it's social because we are undertaking, we're undertaking genres interactively with others. And what about storytelling? Storytelling is an oral performance of an individual reading or interpretation of a narrative text. As such, it coordinates both the narration that takes place in a text, usually written, that's how I read Cinderella, for example, with the storytellers acting out the spoken mode, the performance with all the resources that the spoken mode has to offer. Going back to this idea of a narrative, what is a narrative? Narratives are stories about a protagonist and how this protagonist overcomes a disruption to their habitual state so that then they can go back to this stability, regain stability in their lives. By sharing how protagonists solve different problems, narratives and storytelling as well share culturally accepted ways of perceiving reality, so accepted values, attitudes that are considered to be accepted in that particular community, as well as ideologies. So we can see here that I've highlighted this idea of attitudes because in this presentation, we're going to be focusing this unit, we're going to be focusing on emotions, not in this video, in the following one, and how explicit and implicit these emotions are. So what are the stages in a narrative? What are these bits that we need so that we don't feel frustrated? We have a predictable genre structure that includes an orientation, a complication, a resolution, and we see that we are constantly infusing these different stages with evaluation. Now, what happens with storytelling? Is it exactly the same? Yes and no. Storytelling happens typically face-to-face or through a technological bridge, like could be, like in this case, a recording, as it was the data that I looked at in my PhD. This allows us to pretend that we are face-to-face with an audience. Now, this contextual pressure of the spoken mode expands the purpose of the narrative. And therefore, we find that the storytellers are usually explicitly and directly addressing the audience so as to create some kind of a bridge, a dialogic bridge, to project an interaction with this audience. So they create an interactive relationship with the audience, even if the physical space and time is not shared and it's bridged by technology. Now, this interactive bridge is particularly noticeable at the very beginning and at the very end of the storytelling performances. And this is why we have included these two stages, the opening and the closing. And these are moments in which the storyteller interacts directly with the audience, which are optional. Some storytellers have an opening, but not a closing, or the other way around. Okay. The key function of these two moments in the story, in the storytelling, are to build solidarity, to build this interactive dialogue with the audience. And there you've got a picture of the different storytellers that I looked at for my analysis and description of the data on which this presentation, this unit is based on. Now, all of those data was collected and was looking at all of the storytellers were telling the story of Cinderella, which I'm very sure you're familiar with, but and I could find all of these instances, all of these stages in their presentations, where we have an opening, where the storyteller is in the here and now and virtually interacts with the audience. Then they move to an orientation where they initiate the plot, they set the scene, and they create this context for the complication, right? In the case of Cinderella, Cinderella's family was happy, and then something happened. The mother died, and the father remarried. So this is the context that creates the right setting for the complication to happen, which in the case of the stories that I looked into was the invitation. The invitation arrived, and it disrupted this setting with an unexpected event. They were not expecting this prince to invite them to the royal dance. Now, this first complication is solved. There is a first resolution that is temporary, as Cinderella's problem not being able to go to the ball is solved by this magical physical transformation that was performed by the fairy godmother or by birds, depending on the kind of the version of the Cinderella that was told. Then the second complication is when the prince doesn't know who this beautiful princess is, and so I've named this the unknown princess. This once again interrupts the reality, and we have the prince being left heartbroken until he finds his princess, which is the last resolution, which restates the, a state of new stability for all the characters in the story. The storytellers close the storytelling performance with a closing act, a closing stage. Now, with this, I finish this first section of our first unit, where we have shared some basic ideas about systemic functional linguistics, its perspective on the narrative genre, and also on storytelling, and how these performances have an impact on the narrative genre. These are all of the references that I've used for this first section of our unit. Obrigado, gracias, thank you so much for listening and for being here. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or any comments. My email, as I said, I think, is on the very first or second slide of this presentation.